Hello and welcome everyone to today's Sikhs in Action webinar brought to you by the Sikh Foundation and the Sarbjit Singh Arora Chair in Sikh and Punjabi Studies at UC Santa Cruz. This series highlights how Sikh leaders bring the spirit of seva into public life. And today's conversation, Nirbhau Nirvair, courage, compassion, and Sikh women's leadership explores how these values show up in advocacy, policy, and community care. And for that, we have three incredible guests with us today. Senator Manka Dhingra is the Deputy Majority Leader of Washington State Senate and a longtime advocate for equity and justice. Kiran Kaur Gill is the Executive Director of SALDEF, one of the leading Sikh civil rights organizations in the country. And Mallika Kaur is the Executive Director of Sikh Family Center, where she focuses on gender justice and community care. If you have questions or reflections during the discussion, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit them. And now, Mallika, I hand it over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Tanmeet. Hello, everyone. Sat Sri Akal. We are meeting at a time when this topic could not be more relevant. So, Nirbhau, Nirvair, such core Sikh principles. And so, as three cores, talking about them, I know we can go on for a long, long time. But we're going to approach this like a conversation and start, I think, with the broad question of what Nirbhau even means to each of us. And I just want to recognize this is a time that's difficult. It's a time of loss, of a lot of fear or of rage, which sometimes can be the form fear even takes. And so we might be answering this question very differently today than we may have yesterday or last month. So I just want to recognize that there are different things that are going to come up given the work we're all doing, what the senator's hearing from her constituents, what Kiran's hearing from her clients, what we at Sikh Family Center are hearing on our helpline is going to inform kind of how we answer this. But I did want to start us off with this, then I think we'll build up on each other's conversation. But this idea of what does Nirbhau mean to us and when is it perhaps hardest to live by this value? And since I'm proposing starting on this, I will kick us off by just saying one thing that really came to my mind doing work with the amazing team at Sikh Family Center is something our director of intervention services, Sanjog, recently mentioned, which is fearless does not mean reckless, right? And I think this is especially in today's world of like quick messaging, quick reactions, likes, and like posts and all of that. It sometimes feels like we're reactive, and sometimes we actually may confuse being fearless with recklessness. And so to me, fearlessness, especially right now, means preparing wisely, being alert, thinking about small steps towards somewhat of a clear path, but also not getting dejected when the path is unclear, either because of the systems or the people that we're working around and working with. So I'll just start with that. I'll put that on the table, and both of you, please take it whichever way, different ways you would like.
I'm happy to jump in next because I'm sure Senator Dhingra is going to have a wonderful answer, so I'll go in before I have to follow her. I was thinking about this question, and I think of Nirbhau, fearlessness, and the visualizations that we have in Sikhi, like we see Guru Gobind Singh going into battle with an army behind him, and there's so many, I think, metaphors and this tie-in to battle, to really being a soldier, and that being the vision of fearlessness. And I think that certainly is that's definitely, encapsulates Nirbhau in certain levels. But I also think of Nirbhau, for me, tapping into that fearlessness can also be where situations where you're really putting yourself out there, where you're either taking an unpopular position or you run the risk of public failure.
Mhm.
And I think that in some ways can be scarier for some people because you don't have that army behind you, because you're alone, because you're tapping into your Sikh principles and your understanding of how to advance them and turn them into action. And I think for me, in my role, that is something that I think through. And I think as I'm coming up on, I think, my 6th year at SALDEF, and I had, an executive position before, is just getting better and being more comfortable, really taking those difficult positions and really standing strong if this is what I believe, as the direction of the organization, a policy position we should take, an action we should take, on behalf of the organization, that I don't back down. And, sometimes that means that I may not get the full support for what I believe, but in some cases I'm able to convince people. But it can be a lonely place. And one of the things my dad always told me, and it always stuck with me, this is, as I was starting my work career, he says, success has many fathers and failure is an orphan. And I think that always kind of stuck with me. And I think the true leadership is when you can take ownership and responsibility for both. And hopefully the successes are the ones that you share and you say, these are, because of my team, because of, the leadership, because of the community, and owning the failures and getting through that and getting to a better place. I feel like that is, to me, a sign of a good leader and a way to express Nirbhau.
Thank you for that, Kiran. I'm actually going to start in a very similar way as Kiran did, because when you grow up with Sikh stories, the image that always was in my head was actually women on the battlefield, right? It's so common to see men on the battlefield, but in our Sikh culture and our Sikh stories, we have images of women on horseback wielding swords in the 18th century in a battlefield. And I think it's critical to understand that we, as the Sikh culture, recognize women as warriors, as leaders, as saints. And I think when you grow up with those stories, with that culture, it gives you inner strength. And, I have been the first in so many spaces in all my life as one of the first South Asian prosecutors working in the field of domestic violence over 30 years ago, when most people didn't even understand what that word means. And so I think Nirbhau is that sense of, to me, internal fearlessness that I think so many of us have. And I see over and over again, especially in the women in my lives and women that I've met across the country. And it is being able to tap into that fearlessness, understanding right from wrong, and standing up for those that are less fortunate. And I'll tell you one of my newest favorite stories is when we started having the No Kings rally. And I remember my mom wanting to go, but she hasn't gone to rallies or protests on her own. And I told her, I said, you should absolutely do it, because especially as Indians, as Sikhs, we have a lot of privilege. A lot of us are very affluent. Many of us are citizens. And so it is up to us to make sure we're showing up on these spaces with the privilege we have. And she did it. She went all by herself because none of her friends wanted to go. And she went to that No Kings rally in Northern California. And she told me when she came back that when she looked around, she was one of the very few women of color at that event. And the next time when she went, she took a few of her friends with her. And to me, that is Nirbhau. Like, you are concerned, you are afraid, yet you do it anyway, because you know it is the right thing to do. So to me, that's what it is. And I'm so glad you mentioned the difference between fearlessness and recklessness, because I do think they're completely apart. Fearlessness for me is this internal strength in sticking to your values and really standing up for what's right.
Yeah, thank you. Both of your comments, I mean, I thought of two different things, and one of them, again, on this note of fearlessness and recklessness being different, working with domestic violence survivors, as you have done as well in the past, people often confuse being fearless with being completely outspoken and yelling your story. And so many survivors want what everyone wants: privacy, peace, quiet. So sometimes even our ideas of what a fearless woman looks like are so stereotyped, right? And it does look like somebody with that inner strength of your mom being like, I'm going, even if I don't know who else is coming with me. And get into your point about, just picking up on and having your dad give you this like life lesson about failure and not being afraid of it in a more, in a way that stuck with you. I mean, fear also is something we learn, just like we learn fearlessness. And I think I see this with young women every day almost. Like fear is something that over time, fear of the other, fear of being victimized, fear of not knowing enough, fear of not being enough. These are all things that we get messaging about. And then there's the fear of like, well, I can't change the status quo. And then I'll always be the one who's like the party pooper, always has a contrary view or always has. So it's like we learn this, and it's so important to intervene when this is being taught to the next generation, or sometimes even for ourselves, like to find that moment of just like quiet and turning inside and being like, yeah, that all these no voices just need to stop, or all this noise needs to stop. Um, yeah, I think this idea of freedom from fear being so important to loving, living, leading while we're sick is a beautiful theme. And the hardest time, I think, for a lot of us is when we have to take unpopular stances. Because the Nirbhau idea is it's without exceptions, right? So whether it's a state or a non-state actor, or it's a family member, or if it's a beloved leader. I mean, I'm just thinking of the news with Cesar Chavez and all the victims speaking up decades later right now. That's all over the news today. Whoever it is, the idea of speaking up against oppression has been so consistent in our history. Nothing in our history says fearless except, right? Let's work towards freedom except when so and so is curtailing it. So those are beautiful themes, and I'm wondering how you connect this yourselves to this idea of Nirvair. And I'm especially thinking in this time, right? We have depolarization. We always have in this country had polarization, but it's maybe at a whole new level. We have certain people who have become just icons of what's wrong. And then we have the Sikh principle of Nirvair. And I'm just wondering, like, how do we, how do you all think about this, especially today?
I mean, I can start. I mean, I think, our Sikhi teaches us about Nirbhau, and we talked about that fearlessness aspect, but it also walks us through and tells us to be on our own spiritual journey where we are bettering ourselves. And one of the things we need to do in that journey is to recognize and to I guess fight back against our ego, or to address our own ego and recognize that we're coming from a place where it's our perspective, our vantage point. And so we do our best to navigate our perspectives and how we understand Sikhi and how we understand issues like fighting for the oppressed, fighting for justice, fighting for social justice, but also recognizing that we and everyone else that has those perceptions and ideas are human. So not fighting back or pushing back against an individual, but against these systems of oppression, against these policies that support these systems or certain actions. And I think for me, like I try to differentiate those two because I think you started, this conversation. We are in a very polarized time. There are some very serious things happening in our country. There's some very serious things happening outside of our country. And it's easy to look at people that are proponents of certain policies or ideologies as um, as bad people, and to, have that hate towards them or negativity towards them. And I think that's where we have to look at the full Mool Mantar, starting with, Ikunkar. They are part of us. And a lot of times I've found in my experience in talking to people, and even I remember specifically, I was at the Eradicate Hate conference, I think it was last year or the year before, and there was a former white supremacist who spoke and talked about his own experiences growing up and the harm that individuals caused to him and his loneliness and his self-hate. And a lot of the hate, not all of it, it comes in different ways, but many times it's from individuals not being able to love themselves, not being able to connect to that oneness, not being able to understand, you know, um, others' perspectives because they may not have been able to be in contact with those people, or they may have had experiences that negatively shaped them. And I think for me, understanding that also gives me a level of hope, because if we believe that at the core of our psyche, then we're not fighting demons like in other religions. We're we're fighting and we're advocating for people to recognize the reality within all of us. And that, I think, is the beauty of coming at this from a Sikh perspective.
I just love everything that you just said, Kiran, and it reminded me of, something that I always say, especially coming from the domestic violence background, is that trauma doesn't exert itself as a memory, but it exerts itself as an action or a reaction. And so it is true that hurt people hurt people. And that doesn't mean that you don't have to hold them accountable or that you don't have to call them out on their bad behavior, but really understanding the way in which trauma exerts itself in all of our lives. And so I think that is extremely important. But, we all live our lives and don't really analyze our belief system or how we show up in the world. And I got to tell you, when I decided to run for office, you really have to sit down and think about, what are your values? Why are you putting yourself out in the public field? And one of the things, that's very strong with me is exactly Nirvair. Is, Michelle Obama said, when they go low, we go high. And to me, that is part and parcel of it, is really making sure that I show up with those values, where it is about me standing up for my values, me doing what's right. But in order to do that, you don't need to create enemies. You don't need to engage in the otherness of people. So I think you can have a strong presence. You can lead with your values without creating enemies or without othering people. And it is really hard to do. As you know, I have still the most expensive Senate race in the state of Washington. And there were $3 million spent in attack ads on me. And of course, they used my husband, because you have a turban Sikh man in politics as the spouse. So obviously his image is going to be used. And so the question always arises, like, how do you react? And to me, especially in those times, you have to react with your values. And so to me, it was always about making sure that I'm talking about what I stand for and what my beliefs are, instead of giving in to the hatred narrative that others are engaging in. So I do think that it is important, especially in troubling times, in difficult times, that we take that time to reflect and really make sure that we show up in a way that is consistent with our values and our belief system. And they have to go hand in hand.
Yeah, thank you. I think this deep Sikh value of hatred for the tyranny, rather than for the tyrant. Like, we have seen so many difficult and extraordinary examples in Sikh history, and it's always interesting, like, talking to children who, like, often first come into a lot of conversation like good or bad, hero and villain. And we talk about things like the Mughals. How did Guru Hargobind respond to the person who ordered the death of his father? Like, there's so much in Sikh history that exemplifies that we are standing against tyranny without fear, instead of being focused on personalities and the specific tyrant, to that point of we're seeing humanity in the other. And those are hard things to remember when the tyrant is a torturer, murderer, offender. It's really hard, I think, to remember those things, which is why I think all of Mool Mantar, a lot of our Bani actually feels so aspirational as it is inspirational. We as humans fail. But it is something we want to aspire to, and it's wonderful to have that North Star in Sikhi. It's also a great North Star to have when you're a Sikh feminist, right? It's not because there's this question of like, oh, okay, like, hating men, like feminism is not about hating men, it's about hating oppression. And it's about thinking of equity and it's loving equity. And it's this wild, crazy idea of taking women seriously and being curious about why are there not more women in our boardrooms, in our Senate, in our White Houses? Why are there not more women in those living room conversations? Why are they in the kitchen? Like, no, nothing in our Rehat, in our history, in our Tariq said women will cook and will shush the children and men will make speeches and talk to each other. Like it's wild how little of that we are allowed to question, and sometimes the censorship's from ourselves, right? That's what I have found beautiful and so empowering with the feminism that I've learned through Sikhi is really when it's like there are lots of doubts around, you at least have this inner, like, really huge reinforcement. Like, actually, what would Guru Nanak do? Cool. Like, I'm good. I'm good. I don't have to answer to whoever thinks this is not proper or this is just how things were done or, whatever else. And really how we started Sikh Family Center very much came from this. Post 9/11, we had Sikh organizations doing essential civil rights work, but we looked around and I was already doing rape crisis work since I was 18. And through post 9/11 period, and I kept saying, well, what about the violence that turns inward? Like all communities see a spike in violence when there's external threat, and we have that right now, and should we talk about it? And you get that implicit or explicit sometimes message of wait your turn, that we'll go, geez, we'll get to them, right? And so we could have sat and criticized other Sikh orgs for not taking on this issue, or just created an org and said, we will keep raising this issue along with whoever else wants to. And I think that's something we keep doing. We didn't want this to be gender violence to be a program area within some like larger, these are our authentic Sikh issues. And then we also have a slight other problem out there because what happens always is that issue gets so diluted and it's always a second or third thought by people because it is so normalized. So I think this idea of Nirvair for me also is about not simply joining a call out culture, but thinking about how we can call in while remaining, true to those values, like especially when the going is tough.
So, Mallika, I'll just say, look, everything you said about Sikh feminism, because I think that's very important for us to also unlearn some of the things that we have been told that are based in patriarchy. And this is a conversation I have all the time across generations. And really making sure when we're talking about being feminists, it's not about being anti-man, it's being against the patriarchy. And we come from a religion, we come from a culture which is against patriarchy, but we have to make sure we are talking about that. Sikhism was talking about equality way back in the day, but we have let patriarchy kind of take that away from us. And so I'll just say, I love quoting Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was quoting an abolitionist, when she says, I ask no favor for my sex. All I ask our brethren is to take their feet off our necks and let us just thrive and win the way we would as any other human being. And it is really important that we continue to teach the next generation, regardless of what your gender is, that you have to make sure that when we're talking about our values and our ideals, it is across gender.
Mhm. Yeah, I think I see some questions already in the Q&A, which are about how do we engage people either through education or around different political opinions, like how do we actually engage them? And one thing I can, I'll start with here is this across gender conversation is so essential. And coming back to the hurt that people often have and their own wounds that they often have that no one's talked about. And those wounds could be from growing up without having any sort of emotional support. It doesn't even have to be active child abuse. It can be just emotionally not getting the support and love and care that they needed to develop. And those also can be what we see now in young men across this country, where there is a narrative that is very easy to fall into around you are being wronged, you're being left out, you have to regain your control. And the counter narrative is a tougher one, which is we want to expand the pie for everyone. We want to be respectful to everyone. You don't get to take out your anger on anyone's body or on anyone's autonomy. And those are harder messages. But again, Sikhi is so helpful there, which will, often come back to. And I've had these conversations with older men and with younger boys, some who have very very interesting views about what sort of partners they want and what their wives or daughters tomorrow will or will not be allowed to do. And they're very interesting values. And then we'll talk about, from Sikh history, I'll say, well, I don't know. I feel pretty good here saying you're talking about something that is not in line with the freedom that our gurus were talking about and practiced. And really, Sikhi's love is a difficult love. It's not the kind of love in vogue, right? We're very much about a communal love and not just love for self and our egos, which is what I think it comes down to when people insist on certain kinds of family structures, certain kinds of behavior of women. It's their egos that are getting placated in that, right? And so, but I don't know if either of you want to add more on this question of like, how do we engage people of different viewpoints?
Yeah, I will maybe just add a little. I don't know if I'm directly answering this question, but I did just want to, first of all, when you're talking Mallika, I wish I had the clapping emoji because I don't know where it is in this webinar. And I feel like I will get off the screen somehow if I try to find it. But I totally agree with you 100% that there's space for both of those conversations at the same time. In terms of dealing with the trauma, I know you talked about post 9/11, but also the issues that women in our community face. And it's interesting, it just kind of jogged my memory. SALDEF is coming into its 30th um, anniversary this year. So, we're really talking about and thinking about the founding of the organization. And I'm also, just thinking about the trajectory and my sort of engagement in the organization. Like a lot of organizations, SALDEF, came into existence, post 9/11. It was initially called SMART and then SALDEF. And a lot of the work was around um, pushing back against hate, advocating, for a community, and also, defining and um, really sort of focusing on the Sikh identity, the male Sikh identity for the most part, right? Of the turban and the beard. Obviously, Sikh women also wear the turban, but it was very much focused. There was a big focus on the work in that time. And I lived in New York, you know, during 9/11. I saw the towers go down. I was in New Jersey. My family was there. So I saw what was happening to our community. A lot of my, friends and family members, suffered, were the, you know, whether it was uh, hate speech. I remember a good friend of mine talking about being spit on, assault. There was at a gurdwara, sorry, at a school nearby, there was a young boy whose patka got set on fire. All of that is very real for our community. And there's ways to address that, but also address the issues many women in the community were facing. I remember a story that was shared with me. I wasn't there at the time. SALDEF had started doing law enforcement training as a way to make law enforcement officers aware of the Sikh identity. And they were getting reports that some of the officers had been to homes because of DV issues. And my response when I heard that years later was like, why were we not addressing that as well? Like, why, these are real issues in our community. And I think, I'm the first woman ED in SALDEF in 30 years. Um, I, wish there was a better statistic, but I'm happy to be in this position from the perspective that I feel like I agree with you wholeheartedly that there is room to talk about all of these issues. It may not be SOLDEF space, like maybe it's a collaboration with Sikh Family Center or those that are, have the expertise. But, I think of my own personal experiences that differ from so many of whether it's the founders or board members who are male. I have experienced sexual harassment. I have experienced issues around mental health, self-esteem. I myself, had issues with anorexia when I was younger. Like, you know, I can't say my family have not experienced DV issues, but I know many women in our community have. There is a lot of pressure being put on women in a different way than males in our community, and it doesn't negate the fact that males have, pressures and that we have to be fully supportive. But if we really have that love and the compassion that is at the heart of Sikhi, we have that love and compassion. We should have that love and compassion for everyone because all of us are part of our Sangat. And there can be something really beautiful that happens. Like we can live in the way that our gurus wanted us to, with our Sangat, with our support, with our love, with our inclusivity, with our open hearts, if we allow these stories to be acknowledged, if we challenge ourselves and our community to live our values, if we speak the truth even when it's difficult. I mean, imagine the strength and the power of our Sangat and of a community that can be truly, truly free. That's freedom.
And I agree with you. I think there's a sense of how do we be our own authentic selves. And going back to what you started off with, Mallika, with the question that's also been posed, is talking to people with different backgrounds or middle ground views. And I'll just tell you, middle ground views are status quo. And the status quo is highly problematic for Sikhs, for women. And so to me, it is not about getting along, just going along to get along, because that is how you make sure that our patriarchal structures stay in place, where racism stays in place. And, growing up, you are told you respect your elders, you don't talk back. And it's very challenging when you grow up in that culture and you're still trying to fight for what's right. And I'll tell you, it takes years, sometimes decades, for us to find our voices. And I'll tell you, women, being in your 40s and now starting in your 50s, it's the best thing ever. Because in my 40s, I realized that enough is enough. I mean, I've always been in really tough spaces, but in my 40s, I was like, I am not going to keep quiet because we have the sense of what respect means for the elders in our community. You have to be able to call out bad behavior when you see it. And, when we talk about, we know Sikhs that are MAGA. And to me, you have to call them out on why are they still wearing a turban and outwardly present as a Sikh if they cannot reflect Sikh values. Because let me tell you, there is nothing about Sikh values if you are MAGA, because it is seeped in racism and hatred of the other, which is completely counter to Sikh values. And so to me, there's that disconnect on how are you presenting yourself to the world, and the dichotomy between your belief system and your way of expressing your religion, which are not in sync. And so I think as a community, especially for Sikhi, like that is such a religion that's based on seeing people as one. We come from the same light. Like, how do we embody it? And we have to call out institutional racism. We have to call out historical injustice. We have to call out anti-Blackness and really everything that's happened due to colonialism. And so to me, whenever I hear people talking about, let's pick the middle ground, let's stay in our lane, that is not fighting for what we believe. That is giving in to structures where we are considered less than. And so to me is we have to make sure that we are just not going with the flow because that's the path of least resistance. And in politics, things are partisan. I have many times, a lot of times, I have really good relationships with the Republicans in Washington, and there are many Democrats who believe that I get away with a lot because I say it with a smile. And I think that does go a long way. I do have Republican colleagues who we collaborate with on a very regular basis. I have some MAGA Republican colleagues who I believe have respect for me, but they respect the fact that I stand up and tell them up front what I believe the problems are. And I tell them where I want to go to find the solution. We're not playing a game. We're not being manipulative. They're very clear on where I stand and why. And I think that comes down to respect. So I don't think you have to give in and compromise to be respectful. I think you have to stand your ground and be clear, and you can still be respectful while disagreeing with individuals.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. And I do think this question of, turning the question sometimes instead of just being like, well, shouldn't all points of view? I think turning the question to what is a current day 2026 point of view? How does that 2026 point of view align with our values, our history, and what we say we stand for? And at some point, when people are like, oh no, that's a broader question. I mean, we sometimes have that on these questions around immigration, for example. And I really do think the boot on the neck quote that Senator Dhingra shared. I mean, we're literally seeing that with immigration enforcement right now. And so people who just are like, well, I don't care, that's just not a Sikh value. Like, you not caring about people dying, or you're not caring about people not getting due process is just not a Sikh value. And lots will argue it's not an American legal value, and everything's being challenged and rewritten right now. But I do want to take a minute just to also thank Kiran for, modeling for us, quite frankly. I mean, where's my like clapping emoji? But really modeling for us like why Sikh female leadership moves the entire community towards more equity, more justice, more boldness. And what you shared, Kiran, from a personal experience is like modeling a kind of really bold vulnerability that men historically don't allow themselves. And so they don't ask these questions about mental or really physical health, right? There's always these like silly jokes about that time of the month and hormones and other stuff that like men have started making, which I'm like, okay, but why don't you tell me when you're having palpitations or you have GERD or you have all these issues from stress? Like, why don't you start talking about them? Because we'd all be happier. Like, I remember talking to a man who was really mad one day at a gurdwara, and he was like, oh, the only reason you're all asking about domestic violence is because you want to support the other party and not our party. And I'm like, I don't even know who you are, but okay. I'm like, no, we're talking about domestic violence. And the two things from that interaction that really come to my mind right now are one, what you were talking about earlier, Kiran, like a bunch of outside violence from the outside that Sikhs face, right? So at some point, with a lot of people like that who get really worked up, like, what about all the things happening? I'm like, yeah, but that same man who was spat on, was called names, whose kid was bullied at school, who was told he has a weird accent, he's able to keep it together in the grocery store, on the street. He's able to keep it together in the gurdwara. He's able to even like, be there for like, kirtans and maybe even do them themselves, like, sing and share shabads in gurdwara. But the minute he comes home, suddenly he wants someone to take all that frustration out on, and now we want to excuse it. Like, why, right? And just breaking those things down with people, often in my experience, especially with angry often men, but also a lot of women who are honestly agents of patriarchy just as much as men in so many of our cases. It's a trend we keep seeing. Unfortunately, on the Sikh Family Center helpline, we have women calling about other younger women, often sisters-in-law, young women in their 20s, fully participating in domestic violence. And I'm talking about drugging their sisters-in-law, forcing them to make certain reproductive choices, hitting them, calling the cops on them, and having the cops arrest the victim instead of the abuser. Like, fully, when I say engaging and agents of patriarchy, this is not like, oh, I'm not going to say anything, that's my Veer. It's not just that, or that's my mom. No, like fully taking out their angst about being in this world on another woman, right? So I don't want to just single out and say angry men. We clearly have a lot of pained, angry women who are being oppressive as well. And in any of those discussions, what I like talking about is our double, triple standards, right? Where do we keep it together? Where do we seem balanced? Where do we seem all in touch with our Sikhi? And then what happens in our bedrooms, in our kitchens, in our living rooms when no one's looking? Those are things that have been helpful. But coming back to that really angry man at the Gurdwara, at some point I just stopped and I was like, Tusi langar khaya? Like, have you eaten? And he's like, no. I'm like, you should eat. Not eating makes me really mad too. And he got like a little more agitated for a minute, and then he's just like, "Oh, okay, like I'm going." But it's true, right? I don't mean to be, callous about it, but there's good brain science around this, right? Like we really need those breaks. And we need
And we have a word for it. It's called hangry.
there we go. And we have Snickers ads about it, which I, love, like just being like reminder to ourselves. So I love that Kiran raised this thing about it's our full bodies. We're having all these experiences. And I think that's what women's fearless leadership brings in. These are not softer issues, these are everyday issues. They've always been impacting the community of whatever gender, whatever age. And it's taken women who've come to, the women who have made it to leadership levels using their voice, as Senator Dhingra was saying, like using the privilege, right? Like put our privilege in action. So thank you, Kiran, for modeling that today. That is really powerful. I'm just also wondering if either of you wants to talk about other ways in which you see Sikh female leadership kind of paving the way forward, or things you do to build Sikh leadership, obviously in ourselves, but also in others.
I think you always have to make sure that when you have a place at the table, that you're leaving the door behind you open and making sure you're adding more seats to the table. It is imperative that, like you said, like I love being in this space so much. I love being in any space with Kiran, especially you, Mallika. I just want to like +1 everything you're saying. It is about how we show up in public spaces and how we make sure the next generation is ready to take on these leadership roles. And I cannot stress enough what you said about unlearning patriarchal values. And that's true for all genders. It's not only something that we focus on men, it's men and women. And we're all in this together. We're all allies. I don't think men want different relationships than women do. We all want healthy, respectful relationships in our personal lives, intimate lives, in our larger lives. And so to me, this is not a men versus women conversation. It is a family community conversation on how do we create healthy relationships? How do we make sure all our children understand consent, including adults, and really making sure that when we have that space and we show up in those spaces, we are encouraging and inviting the next generation to do the same. And that's what I love about Kiran. Every time we're at a conference together, she will call the youth up and have them do a presentation or have them moderate or somehow make sure we're elevating them. And I love doing that too. I mean, every time I have run, I've had a youth campaign committee. I love hosting pages, going to schools and colleges and universities. And I actually did not fully understand that when I decided to run for office, the manner in which I will be viewed by others. We're always used to being viewed, right, as women, and especially women of color. But some of the most meaningful comments I have received is from younger women of color and what it means for them, seeing someone who looks like them in public spaces, in spaces where they traditionally have not seen women like us. So I think each of us, with the work that we do, the way in which we show up, we are expanding what it means to be women in color. And so I do believe that everyone I have interacted with actually takes up that space very deliberately. And that is what I love, because I think you have to be deliberate when you're in these spaces so that you can make sure the next generation is ready to lead as well. And I see that over and over again. It just warms my heart. Of course, I have what I call the wall of shame, where we do have bad actors, where we do have women, people of color showing up, and you're just like, oh my God, can you please stop? But I think that's always also true that you show the alternative, that this is how we show up and why. Obviously we're showing up because we think we're right, but with that sense of are we standing up and talking about our values and talking about what makes us authentic and why we're doing the work that we do. And I do think when we talk about our values, that is when we build a larger coalition. Because I don't care what your political views are, but when you're talking about strengthening communities, strengthening families, standing up for others, you can build that wider coalition because there are a lot more people who believe and have those values than don't.
Yeah, no, thank you, Mallika. I wholeheartedly agree with everything that you said. I think for me, I have the privilege of working with a lot of youth through our sick lead program. I think this year's cohort will be close to 80 sick leaders from across the country, and a lot of them are young women. And I think in the last, couple years, as I've worked with the different cohorts and had the opportunity to work with some of the young women that maybe later intern for us or join as fellows, I think I've always tried to encourage them to go into spaces, to challenge themselves, and um, to really try to build their self-confidence. I've noticed with a lot of young women, and I don't know, I don't want to say this is just a women thing or a men thing, but this is just my experience, that a lot of times we want to have the exact, you know, the exact perfect thing to say, or excuse me, they want they don't have the same comfort in being in certain spaces because I think that's a societal thing, right? They may not see women in certain spaces, or they may not have seen, women talking boldly about different positions, or they might not know how to navigate, these spaces. And I think I'm have some unique experience, and I can offer some guidance here because in my own personal experience, I was in these spaces as an executive from a very young age. And I'll say somewhat facetiously, I've seen, been in many rooms with men speaking very confidently about topics they know nothing about, um, offering not a lot to a conversation, but have, complete confidence that everyone wants to hear what they have to say. And I feel, um, I don't convey it like that to young folks, but to say like, hey, if you have something that you think is important, whether it's a question, whether it's a comment, whether it's an observation, your perspective, you have every right to be in that room, in those rooms, and to share that. And so I think that's what I've tried to encourage, and then I can see over time as they get more comfortable, as they maybe learn the subject matter better or get more familiar with different networks, that confidence grows. And you can just see it's like such a heartwarming thing to see that these young women will really take up space and come into these conversations not only confident but leading them. And that's what I love to see. And I fortunately have gotten to see that over and over through the program and again through my experiences here at SALDEF.
Yeah, thank you both for that. And I'm gonna check the questions in a second, but I also think this idea of a model, right? There isn't a model to step into immediately is is something that people who have historically had models and people looking like them in these spaces, they usually have the privilege to not worry about it, right? And here we're often thinking, oh, I'm the first one or the only one, or if I say something wrong, and just sharing that journey with other folks is really helpful, regardless of age, regardless of gender. I think this angst about saying your truth is a real one, right? And that's why it helps to pause and really turn inwards. And that's why I think like nickname matters, or that's why I think our red matters. Like people will say, oh, if Sikhi is about big tent, everybody, you love everybody. Why do we have certain rules? Well, rules give us structure. It helps because the rest of the world is so unstructured and in spirals that we might just get caught into that. So I think it's really beautiful to have you both kind of talk about both being first, but making sure you aren't the only ones, right? We have people that are coming up after us. And it's also, I do think this idea of like, we do not live single issue lives, right? There's so much happening, and that there's that famous Audre Lorde quote about there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we don't live single issue lives. For me, that's always really important to keep in mind, because when we hear comments, like people listening in the audience today too, like when you hear those little comments that you have an inkling are going to make somebody uncomfortable, but you're not sure if you should stop the meeting and address them, follow your gut, like trust your gut, right? Because when you hear, like recently, I was talking, we were in a space, very vocal men, kind of like Kiran's describing, who really didn't know what they're talking about, but they were very vocal. And there was another woman and me. And one of the men, actually, to prove how progressive he was, said, and I work with all these young women. And then he started talking about one of the women. And instead of saying she's smart or she has great ideas or she's bold, he's like, badi soni kudi hai. Like, she's very beautiful. And he said it 3 times. And the other woman with me just stopped him and she's like, I know you think this is a compliment, but then when you talk about the next woman and don't say Sonia, that's like a diss, right? And so can we just not comment on people's bodies? And the whole room's just silent. And they're like, oh, okay, okay, we won't, right? Like, but we have to create that discomfort. I think that's like the fearlessness that's so important. And seeing women exercise it is what gives me inspiration. Like in being in a Sikh space, like why I work with the Sikh community, why I decided, Sikh Family Center for a long time was entirely volunteer run, but we looked at each other and we're like, this is run on the backs, unpaid labor of young women. We need to find salaries for them. And then eventually, I stepped in as executive director, and I'm still here from acting executive director. The act is still on, because there's something so inspirational working with Sikh women who are walking this talk. So thank you to both of you. And I also, yeah, I'm wondering if there's anything else either of you would like to add, in general, in response to the topic, in response to any questions or what others have said. But I know there's a lot to be said, but we have about 7 minutes.
Yeah, no, I do. There was a very specific question about accidents and sick drivers and having skills, including English. And I think when you talk about problems you're seeing in the country, you have to think about, is this a new problem or has this always existed? Is there a difference now? And when you start questioning what the problem is and whether it's a real problem, you have to understand why it's being questioned. And a lot of it, unfortunately, comes down to racism and white supremacy. And there are times when people create problems when none really exist. And so you have to question, what is the basis of it? Like recently, we've had issues around Somali people who have childcare centers. This is not a real problem. It is a problem steeped in racism. With truckers and safety, let's really understand, is it really about truckers not being safe, or is it, again, steeped in racism? And so this is where I will always say consuming media, getting information is really critical. And as we show up in this world, if you want to be fearless, if you want to be full of compassion, you have to challenge what, frankly, you're being fed as real problems, especially in America these days. And so I really challenge everyone to really start thinking critically of what you're hearing from people and trying to get to the basis of why that is becoming an issue now if it wasn't a few years ago. Like, what has changed? And if the thing that has changed is public perception or the leader who embodies white nationalism, then you really have to critically think through that. So I always tell people, I'm always happy to work on real problems, but I will not work on fears or issues that are seeped in hatred.
Thank you. So well said. That's perfect. The sensationalization of certain things and then dehumanization of certain people through those sensationalized events, like is a real problem. That's the real problem. But yeah, thank you. Kiran, any thoughts, any closing thoughts, comments you want to add?
It's always hard to follow Senator Dhingra. So, I mean, I 100% agree with what she shared. And I know that's actually something that I fought for in terms of our priorities moving forward is combating the mis and disinformation. Because feel like in my lifetime, I've seen, a rise in that. And I think there's so much context to what you started with, Mallika, and you shared earlier. A lot of these issues are complex and they require a level of understanding that cannot be captured in one sentence on social media or through one post. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to educate ourselves and to understand, the root causes and the history of some of these issues that we're seeing today. Because in this country, we have that opportunity to exercise our right to vote, exercise our civic engagement in democracy. And I think it's a way of really putting into action our Sikh values. And so maybe this is not exactly where we started, but I guess I would end, because this is where we're ending up. I would really encourage everyone to be as informed as possible. And I know we're all on our journey in Sikhi, but I think we collectively will be in a good place if we can marry our Sikhi with our actions and our civic engagement. Then I think we are on track for a better experience and future in this country.
The smartest thing to do would be to end there. Extremely well said. Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you, Senator Dhingra. Thank you, Kiran. I enjoyed this break in my day. This is revitalizing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mallika.
Thank you. Sat Sri Akal, everyone.
Bye. Sat Sri Akal.